Welcome to Boston University and our School of Hospitality Administration, continuing our Summer Conversations series. My name is Leora Lanz. I'm a proud faculty member at the school. I teach the marketing classes. I'm chair of our master's program and our leadership summit. And it is a joy for me to bring this panel to you today for what I am sure will be a really interesting conversation. I want to welcome, there are approximately 170 folks who registered for today's panel, so thank you for joining us. I want to welcome our faculty and our staff, our students, our alumni, and frankly, so many industry colleagues who have signed on to join us today. We're thrilled that you're with us, so thank you so much. I want to start by introducing our panelists, the four guests that we have. And before I do so, I just want to ask everyone to please make sure you mute your mic in the meantime, except for our panelists, of course, and shut your video at this time. You could put us into speaker mode and get to see our guests today. Let me start with introductions. We've got live from London, Mr. Russell Kett. Russell is the chairman of the London office of HVS, and I will say the leading global specialist hospitality valuation and consulting firm, because that's my alma mater too. Russell joined HVS in 1995. He has more than 40 years of experience in this business with hotel consultancy, investments, real estate, providing valuations, feasibilities, brokerage, investment, asset management, and related consultancy services. He's advised hotels, apartment hotels, hostel companies, banks, developers, and investors on all aspects of the industry related to their interests in Europe and the Middle East and Africa. Thank you, Russell. It means a lot that you're here. Thank you.
Pleasure to be with you.
Russell, let me also add, he's received a Lifetime Achievement Award from HOSPA in 2011 and the Hall of Fame Lifetime Achievement Award at the Hot E Hotel Investment Conference in London just a couple of years ago. He's also a fellow of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors and a member of the International Hotel Investment Council. So it is definitely an honor that you're with us today. Thank you. I also want to introduce Patricia Boo. Patricia is Director for Central and South America for STR. She's based in Colombia. She's responsible for the organization's expansion throughout Latin America. Patricia spent her career in the hotel industry at property level between Madrid and London until she joined STR in 2008. She's a regular lecturer at the Rey Juan Carlos University in Madrid, specializing in benchmarking for their revenue management courses. Thank you, Patricia. I also want to introduce Adeline Phua, a fellow HVS alum as well. Adeline heads HCC Verimag, a boutique real estate consulting firm. She's a hospitality investment specialist with over 15 years of experience based out of Shanghai and Singapore. Adeline has provided advisory services and executed transactions in various capacities to leading global hospitality firms for projects across Asia, as well as the United States, Europe, and South America. Adeline, it's great to see you.
Thank you for having me, Leora.
Absolutely. And finally, a dear friend, Kaushik Vardharajan, live from New Delhi. Kaushik has almost 2 decades of global hotel consulting and development experience. Kaushik started his consulting career with HVS and spent 15 years there, starting in New York, and then led the firm's operations as Managing Director, South Asia in Delhi, and as a partner, Managing Director for Asia Pacific out of Singapore. Kaushik worked on and oversaw more than 1,500 valuations at his time there, feasibility studies, management contract negotiations, and strategic consulting assignments at HVS. He then spent 4 years at Hilton as Vice President of Development and led Hilton's growth and expansion across India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. Kaushik has a diploma in hotel management from the Institute of Hotel Management in Kolkata, and a bachelor's and MBA in hospitality administration from Johnson & Wales University. He's also a graduate of the Owners and Presidents Management Program at Harvard Business School. And I'm also pleased to announce that officially, as of next week, July 1, he will be joining me as the faculty among the faculty at the School of Hospitality at Boston University. And we're thrilled, Kaushik. So welcome to the Shah family.
Thank you, Leora. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Once again, if you can just shut your videos before we get started. Just a couple of housekeeping items. I want to encourage questions in the chat. You'll see Jane Wang momentarily here. Jane is a rising senior. We're proud of our students and so glad they can participate in this program. We're going to do our best to get to as many of the questions as possible. Jane is going to be checking the chat and connecting with me throughout to make sure we can answer your questions if we haven't already in the conversation. Thank you, Jane. And we also hope that you take away from this what we can learn from each other. That's really the point of this, is what we can learn from each other. This is certainly not an exhaustive global look, but these are friends and colleagues with whom we trust their insights and opinions. And so we know we're going to get some really intelligent observations today. So let's get started. And Addie, we're going to start with you in Asia. Let's start with your thoughts based in Asia. When did you see the impact of the situation really begin? Share with us your thoughts on how what happens in China is also so important to so many other parts of the world.
Thank you, Leora, for the introduction. I mean, I've worked with Leora for a long time at HVS and a mentor and marketing expert that I know. And so when she invited me, I was very pleased to speak and join her on this panel. To answer for Asia, I've been in, today I'm actually in Singapore, though, you know, the background is really showing Shanghai. I've been back in Singapore for what was to be the Lunar New Year holidays. And I've been here ever since because of the COVID-19 and because international travel was restricted shortly after. I did not intend to stay so long. I was only planning 10 days. So I think we started to see an impact immediately from China, in China, when they started to restrict people towards the end of second half of January, just before Chinese New Year, during the Golden Week. For the rest of Southeast Asia or North Asia, I think we started to see impact, you know, soon after, because China was a lot of China visitors were traveling out, and I think. But I think for outside China, the real impact really started from the end of March, the last week of March, going on into April and May, as countries started to shut borders. So I think, you know, in terms of hospitality, in terms of the hotels, performance really started to see a major impact, just, you know, come to a standstill, really. We started to see entertainment facilities, restaurant, bars, all just shut. Hotel occupancies plummeted. You know, some hotels actually closed because there was no business, especially in markets where tourism is a major part of business. For example, Thailand or Vietnam, even Singapore, to start on. So, but I think some countries have already started to see lifting. We'll speak about it a little later. So what Leora mentioned about, you know, why China is important. I think China is important because there are a couple points we need to realize. China's GDP, China's contribution to global GDP in 2003 was just 4%. And I think by 2018, closing in 2018, that has become 16%. So global supply chains, you know, in and out of China dominate global trade. And that's why with COVID, we do see the lack of, Chinese capital or capital as well as human flow being restricted, not only by China, but the rest of Asia, where it's such a big part of business travel being. And so in terms of tourism and hospitality, China is the largest source market, and it has been since 2012 by a study, by UNTO. And the tourists actually account for 277 billion US dollars worldwide, and that's 150 million outbound trips. So China is really the top, if not largest, feeder markets for many countries where tourism is important. So I guess it's important to also note that China has a huge potential because over 90% of their citizens, of the population, has not traveled overseas. So if we're looking at 277 billion as of 2018, you can look at that, times tenfold. That's where the potential of China is. And so, it's a huge impact.
Adeline, thank you for those incredible numbers, and thank you for sharing that context, because that really helps set the tone. I want to work our way westward, I guess. Kaushik, in terms of when did we first start seeing the impact for your region of the world, whether it's India and the surrounding countries? What can you share with us?
Yeah, hi, Leora. Hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Okay. So, I think we had a good start to the year. We had a good year in 2019 across the region, South Asia, and we had a good start to the year, and the expectations were that we would have a great year overall. Jan and Feb went well. Just as we got into February is when we started hearing about cases, one-off cases in this part of the world. Nepal saw the first case in South Asia, and then we started hearing a few more. It started really coming up on people's radar. I took a flight in the first week of March, and everything was normal and well with the world. It was really when we got to the mid of March, is when I think people started to realize the seriousness of the pandemic. That's when the word pandemic also started becoming more commonly used in the media. And just about that point of time is when you really started seeing the impact. Hotels started seeing large-scale cancellations, especially on the meeting and group side. And you started seeing people restricting travel if they didn't have to. And by the time we got to the third week of March, to be exact, on the 24th of March, is when Prime Minister came on air and announced a complete 3-week lockdown. So 1.3 billion people locked down at home, with travel restrictions beginning immediately. I think that's when the hotel industry came to a complete standstill because people were unable to travel. And since then, you've seen continued lockdowns going on until the end of May. So the industry overall has been seriously impacted.
Russell, what about heading over toward Western Europe and your observations from the UK?
Yeah. The timescale was pretty similar. We first started to become conscious of something happening out of a place called Wuhan in China towards the end of February. And actually that was when I made my last trip to your wonderful country and met with my partners and colleagues in Texas. Having said all of that, I flew back to London on the 29th of February. And ever since then, I've been grounded. And gradually, Europe started a series of lockdowns, different countries taking their own time to reach the conclusion that a pretty well permanent shutdown was going to be required. Not every country, I hasten to add. And some countries continued as normal and didn't have the sort of impact that a few countries did. I think we've got to wait until someone writes the book to find out why countries like Italy were first exposed and had such a bad impact, and particularly the UK. UK has been exceptionally badly hit. A lot of cases, sadly, a lot of people losing their lives. But effectively, we're in lockdown and still are in lockdown. They're gradually opening things, and different countries moving at different paces. But we've heard today that the hospitality industry in the UK is being released from lockdown on July the 4th. Now, I think that's a mildly significant date in America, isn't it?
Just mildly.
Just mildly.
Yes.
I think you learned it from us in the first place.
We did.
So July the 4th is a significant day when the hospitality industry in the UK can start trading again. And many countries in Europe have already started releasing their hotels from lockdown. And it's a slow process, and it will take a while. And certainly as a company, we're not saying to people, just because you can open means you should open. We're saying, make sure that you get it right and open at the right time when you can make money rather than lose more money than when you were closed.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment too. Thank you, Russell, for that. And Patricia, let's head to South America to just get a sense of when did you start seeing things kicking in, and what your observations were in your region of the globe.
Yeah, we actually started to see the impact a bit later, even though I think the first cases were towards the last days of February, beginning of March. I guess the impact really, or people really started to make, to be aware of what's happening after the WHO announced the global pandemic as such, which was on the second week of March. I was at the time in Brazil, and I remember that I was with some colleagues from university, and they started just thinking, okay, what are we doing? Are we going home? We don't want to be locked in Brazil, you know, for we don't know how long. So most of us decided to make our way home. And what is different, I guess, about Latin America is that the lockdowns happen pretty quickly compared to other parts of the world, and they were quite strict. So in general, in South American countries, they adopted a very restrictive human mobility measures to try to reduce the impact of the pandemic. You know, we went from total blockages, not only the borders and commercial activities closing down, but also curfews. And we are still in that situation for most of the countries. Brazil has been slightly more, it's taking things a bit more lightly than we would like to, and we're seeing the impact. Now it's the third country around the world in terms of number of cases. But I guess something for those that are not aware of the region to highlight is all of this, you know, we're already into 3 months of completely locked down, and the impact that it has on the most vulnerable parts of society. You know, there's a large portion of vulnerable segments within Latin America, and also the impact that it's having on the migrant population, which some of you may be aware, particularly coming from Venezuela. So it's a social aspect that is the most worrying at the moment here.
Yeah, that's a tough part for all of us, I can imagine, but it sounds like it's really, really instrumental in your part of the globe. Patricia, when we talked recently, you said there was some demand in hotels in certain countries. Could you share with us where you were seeing demand coming in from, and where you were seeing some hotel activity?
Yeah, during the lockdown, the majority of hotels started to close down, as you know, around the world, and same for Latin America. The one country where we're seeing actually occupancy levels around 40 to 50%, which is very unusual for considering the situation, is Peru. And that has to do mostly with an initiative that the government took. There's been talking a lot about the public-private collaborations, and this is a good example. So the Peruvian government, they didn't want to stop certain activities, including mining, which is a big percentage of the GDP for them. And what they did is that they arranged contracts with the hotels to host all the mining workers, as well as health professionals, expats, repatriates that were trying to get back to their country. And all of those were staying at the hotels. They were including full accommodation and also, you know, F&B into that contractual, into that contract that they did with the hotels. So many hotels that closed down thinking of, well, there's not gonna be demand because of the COVID-19, they have to reopen to accommodate this type of demand at the time, and they continue.
Russell, did you also see demand in certain parts of between UK and EU? Was there any demand coming in or any observations that you want to share?
A few hotels have remained open because they service the needs of key workers and enable people who perhaps would otherwise have to be quarantined from their families to be able to have somewhere to stay that isn't on the floor of their place of work or whatever. So a very small number of hotels have remained open. And if you look at the STR data for April, particularly and May, for those hotels that remained open, occupancy was relatively low, no more than around 10 or so %. Yes, ticking over, but not very much happening. Although some hotels that really did major on it, because everywhere else was closed, they've done quite well. And they haven't had to furlough as many of their staff as they might otherwise have done.
Right, right. Kaushik, anything you want to add from your perspective? Was there any demand or occupancy anywhere, or did everything sort of shut? How did that work?
So I think the trends are pretty similar to what we saw, what you saw in other parts of the world. A lot of the demand evaporated pretty quickly, and what was left was really healthcare workers, emergency workers, people who were stranded in certain cities because they couldn't get home, and extended stay guests who have been staying in that city for a while, or foreigners who've been here and couldn't leave the country. So a lot of that demand was really centering around these few buckets. In terms of kind of the regular demand, or the most common type of demand that we're used to, we haven't seen that in a long time. What we also saw in the middle was when we had evacuation flights come in, then hotels were used as quarantine facilities for incoming citizens. And so hotels were able to generate, that were closer to the airport, were able to benefit from it. But after a certain point of time, when the evacuation flights were done, those hotels went back to lower levels of occupancies. We are now getting to a stage which started towards the end of May, when the countries now started opening back up. Because I think that's a debate across the world. You want to stay closed as long as possible to battle the spread of the pandemic, but there's also the economic side to it. And as Patricia was talking about, there is a cost to be paid, and sometimes, and I think in a lot of our countries, one segment's impacted more than the other. So India has started opening up. We are seeing similar things happening in Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, because you can't stay closed forever. So now you're starting to see some demand come back up in some markets, mainly in the resorts and leisure markets where you can drive to, because I don't think people are still comfortable getting on a plane and going anywhere. And I think that's going to have an impact as you look at recovery. I think the amount of domestic demand each country generates is going to play an important role in how quickly the markets recover.
And we've certainly heard that in the United States as well, of course. Addie, anything you want to add in terms of hotels and demand and occupancy, whether it was throughout the period of the original wave, I guess, or the first wave that you had in Asia, or what you're seeing now?
I think it's quite interesting to see that, obviously, I'll speak about China first. China has come back in terms of business since April. So business is back to normal. But we've seen hotel occupancies in tier 2 and tier 3 markets come back first. In fact, in some of the provincial capitals with strong business originally have come back to pre-COVID levels in terms of business demand for hotels, and that's across board. I think first-tier cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, they're still lagging behind, but amongst the tier ones, Shenzhen seems to be doing slightly better. I think because of the technology and digital strength, and it's one of the key cities in China that's leading this effort, and that's driven by the government as a new economy strength. So that's for China. So markets have come back. You also see that since the April holidays, there were two major holidays that have happened. That was the Qingming holiday as well as the Labor Day holiday, and then this weekend will be the Dragon Boat public holiday. Leisure destinations that are 2 hours within 2 hour self-drive of major cities are booked out. So you do see weekend demand coming back on Friday and Saturday nights. I think the same has, for Southeast Asia, the same has happened for selected resort markets that, for example, in Thailand, Hua Hin, I know of Chiang Mai that has come back, some of the Vietnamese in Phu Quoc, for example. So, but what's interesting to note is, I think for Singapore, Singapore is a typical business city, and we have very little domestic demand. If we look at year-to-date figures, hotel occupancies are a lot. It's rather high at 60%, and I think that has filled up from the mid-scale first. Obviously, that's the bulk, and it was supported really by stay-home quarantine orders from returning residents as well as foreign employment. And Singapore, there's a lack of demand, lack of supply for hotels, throughout the year. So, but what has come back is we've had a spike with because of high density foreign workers dormitories, and so hotels have been used to ease that sort of demand, as well as foreign workers that are from Malaysia, and they actually do a daily commute. So the borders was closed, they couldn't go back, and so they've had to put up in these sort of accommodations. So I think for Singapore, that's where it's been interesting to see that hotel occupancies still maintained, but obviously ADRs suffered, obviously, because it's a government budget. There are employers who are paying for it. So I mean, it's been pretty low compared to a typical time. Yeah.
We're going to talk more about Singapore, I think.
Can I just add something, Leora?
Absolutely,
Sorry.
Patricia. Absolutely, please do. No, not at all.
Just listening to Adi, what we've seen in China and what she mentioned, we are actually seeing it in other regions as well. So the US is a good example with the domestic demand, and also how those leisure destinations, particularly those that are driven distance, so you can actually drive over there like 3-4 hours maximum on time, is where we see peaks on the weekends. And that same trend, we are starting to see it in some destinations around Europe, particularly with bank holidays or public holidays taking place. We've seen the same trend, and I just thought it was worth mentioning because the data is definitely backing what you just said.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. And actually, I wanted to go back to what you mentioned about Peru and the government support, particularly in Peru, that you noticed. Patricia, was there any other sort of government, quote, bailout? That's the term that we've been hearing in the United States, but is there any more sort of government support that you've seen throughout the region in addition to what you highlighted in Peru? And I'm going to ask the same of our guests, of our other panelists.
Absolutely. We are seeing some tax relief coming from countries like Peru and Colombia. So here in Colombia, just last week it was announced that hotels will be exempt to pay the VAT until the 31st of December, so throughout the rest of the year. and Peru has taken similar measures. Other measures that we've seen, like if I use Brazil as an example, their focus has been more on the labor measures. So their first approach, and here there's been a lot of collaboration between not only between public and private, but also within different associations within the industry. And they started working on the suspension of some of the contracts and the lowering working hours to take a little bit of the pressure of the cash flows for the hotels. And the government, what it's done is created some sort of insurance, like an insurance fund, or insurance pool, to cover the costs for those employees that where their contracts were suspended. Those are the main measures that we've seen across the region.
Super, thank you. Thank you. Russell, anything you want to share in terms of what you've seen? Because I know there has been some relief.
Yeah, the many governments, most governments within Europe have given some sort of support to their entire economies, not just to the hospitality sector. But the hospitality sector remains concerned that some of the schemes are going to be withdrawn before we've actually got the full need from them. I think particularly furlough schemes where governments are supporting the continued employment of people, but only until the autumn. And we're concerned because not everybody is likely to be required to be back at work in that time scale, and therefore what do you do about these people? I suspect that it's going to lead to a number of people losing their jobs permanently rather than just temporarily. Governments have also provided soft loans and cash flow support. Initiatives like VAT deferring, property tax deferring and stuff like that has had a beneficial effect on our sector. And if I may just come back to what was being said, what we're seeing in Europe, very similar to what Adi was talking about in China and so forth, is that the drive-to markets are the first to come back. Domestic leisure, staycations as they're called over here, I'm sure that's a word everybody globally is now becoming familiar with. And of course, revenge tourism, where you've got people who've been cooped up for weeks and months and who are desperate to get out and to have some sort of a break. They're going to be the ones who are going to be making the break for freedom, and Germany so far has witnessed that. And Germans, as you know, will get into their BMWs and drive for hours just to be able to take advantage of that. So domestic tourism, very much the savior in the first instance of hotels as they're reopening in Europe.
Thank you, Russell. Kaushik or Adeline, I don't know if anybody wants to add anything else about government support or some assistance for the industry. Kaushik?
So I'll keep it quick. I mean, we've been quite jealous sitting here in India looking at the relief packages that have been provided to the industry in other parts of the world. India did come up with some sort of economic package, stimulus package to support the economy in general. But really the key initiative for hospitality was that they got a moratorium, a 3-month moratorium at that point of time on principal and interest repayments. That now has been pushed out to 6 months. Other than that, we haven't seen much. And I think other countries in the region have really been focused on the larger economy also.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Adeline, anything you want to add to this?
I think maybe for the Asian countries, we do see a difference for the slightly more affluent countries versus the less affluent countries. Those that can afford it are using country reserves. For example, in Singapore, 52 billion of reserves are directed to COVID efforts, with total 93 billion being spent as part of injecting it into the economy. I think some others, you do see governments trying to step in. For example, in Vietnam Airlines, I think they're doing a lot of destination promotions together with the tourism offices, national tourism offices. So I guess other than that, you know, you do see property tax rebates. Some of the REITs have had their distributable taxable income being extended. So I think generally it's probably in some form here or there. There's also cleaning cost, defrayment of cost by the government that they're picking up. So yeah.
Super, super. I want to take a moment now because there has been a lot of activity in the chat. Russell, you did say no question was off limits, so I'm going to come to you with this one. Actually, this is a question from one of our industry colleagues, Peter Beta with Frontera Hospitality Group. And he's asking actually specifically, Russell, what is the plan for, or is there a plan for the excess real estate that might be available around the globe when leases expire, or if hotels stop operating? Has there been any discussion on that, either at HVS front or just rumblings in the industry?
There's a lot of discussion about that because, as you may well realize, for leased hotels, and I realize that is perhaps a peculiarly European phenomenon, and those in Germany will be very familiar with the leased market. But leased hotels that are on fixed leases will be very much affected, particularly if they are closed. No income and a lease payment to make. So there's been a lot of discussion between the lessor, the property owner, and the lessee in order to try and defer the payment of rent, or to find some way of avoiding being thrown out of the hotel. Now, fixed rents in most cases are going to have to be renegotiated. We're going to have to find that the situation in the leased hotel market is so desperate that some are just going to give up. They're going to offer to walk away, and those hotels are going to find themselves either sold or perhaps turned into something else. And there's talk of some hotels becoming hospitals, some hotels becoming residential units, and serviced apartments is one area that this particular pandemic is seen as being particularly, I'll use the word attractive for, because you can be more isolated, and it's quite clear that that type of a business is easier to service than a regular hotel. But at the moment, we're anticipating that there'll be some sort of shrinking in supply in Europe, that the vast number of hotels that were due to be developed, the pipeline that was there as of March, April, some of that is going to get completed, some of it is going to get abandoned, some of it is going to get delayed. But there will be buildings that will come onto the market that will be picked up for let's just say, a fraction of their real value.
Thank you, Russell. Does anybody else want to add to that in terms of excess real estate? Has there been any discussion? We're going to move ahead then. I think that was a helpful response. So thank you, Russell, very much. There's another question here. Somebody's asking about crisis management plans. Are they now part of a requirement for hotels, short-term rentals, or any other sort of hospitality asset in terms of crisis planning? You know, in my mind, I think that's what we're doing anyway. I feel like we're living in a crisis management planning, you know, a dynamic situation. But has anyone heard the term being used as part of sort of a reopening opportunity?
So I think, Leora, yeah, I'll take that. I think we are definitely seeing more of that. You know, I mean, I think everybody's talking about it now. And I think there is a growing awareness that there needs to be better planning for this going forward. In all our projections and all our performers and all your analyses that you do, I don't think any business plan ever assumed that you would go from 70 or an 80% occupancy down to single digits for an extended period of time, or zero occupancy or zero revenues for an extended period of time. And I think that's something. So when, you know, the whole concept of stress testing, I think will be a very different exercise going forward. I think you're going to now consider that you might have this happen again, and that you might go for an extended period of time where you have no revenues, and how do you create an organization, and how do you create a business plan that helps you survive that.
Super, super. Thank you, Kaushik. I want to get back to some of the questions and conversations that we had not too long ago. And Addie, you've brought up Singapore once or twice, and I do think Singapore makes such an unusual and incredible case study in terms of how they handled this entire situation. And you did allude to it, but if you could sort of share with us, you know, sort of what we learned from Singapore or what we've observed from Singapore specifically.
I think I've been fortunate, well, to be back in Singapore during this period of time. I must say that it's been, I feel that what the government has done is phenomenal. I think they're also able to do it because of two reasons. One, Singapore is small. The second thing is Singapore has large reserves that they're able to, you know, use or utilize and direct. So I think in terms of its planning, you know, being very kiasu, that's a very local term, you know, we're scared to lose per se. But I think what they did was basically, there were two instances. So we started off having a very good management in place. And then, you know, because of high density in some of the foreign worker dormitories, numbers started to surge. And that's where in the beginning of April, the government put in place a program called the circuit breaker. In other countries, that would be known as a lockdown. So we were on there for about 2 months, and the economy is just starting to reopen in a 3-phase period. The first phase started in middle of May, and then we just started phase 2 last Friday. And phase 3, you know, it depends on when the vaccine will be found. So in phase 2 last week, I'm able to have to dine as well as receive guests at home, but we're only allowed with 5 people. And schools, sporting facilities, you know, home-based businesses, they're allowed to open. So, you know, people are returning to schools. So social, cultural, religious, business gatherings, as well as senior citizens, that will have to wait till phase 3. So for Singapore, for a country like Singapore, you know, we're highly dependent on international trade and the global economy. So when we have something like, you know, what we have now with the pandemic, it's more than a sneeze. So even a sneeze could affect Singapore drastically. But, you know, like I said, I think, you know, the government has worked well to introduce all these measures with rebates, with, you know, loan deferments and all sorts of incentives and programs to help businesses. So I think we need that until international travel is able to resume, because such a large part of our economy is reliant on international trade.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for sharing with us, you know, those lessons learned. Couple more questions that are coming in that I do want to share. We were talking about sort of this excess real estate, but are we going to see more distressed hotel assets around the globe? Not that I want to get dismal, but what's the thought for what might be happening in that from that perspective?
Let me kick off. I would be hard pressed to think of any hotel in the world at the moment that isn't distressed, or any hotelier who isn't distressed, and anybody who isn't is seriously lucky. So let's just assume that there is a globe full of distressed hotels. I think what the questioner is perhaps anticipating is getting their hands on some of these distressed assets in a way that they can pay a fraction of the real price or the real value in order to get a bargain.
And that's the question, is valuation.
And that's sadly something which we can expect. When you have an immediate loss of EBITDA, of earnings in a hotel, the likelihood is that the value of that hotel will have gone down. The extent to which it's gone down is dependent on that individual hotel. But in the very short term, yeah, you suffer a a drop in your business and you anticipate building back over a period of time, the value will go down. Now, the question is, how do you realize that value? You typically only realize that value when you have to come to sell. So the longer that you can put off having to sell a hotel, hopefully your value can start to come back to the levels where it were. And therefore, what we're anticipating, certainly in Europe, is that we're expecting occupancy levels to come back in about 3.5 years and average room rates to come back in about 4.5 years on average. So what's an average hotel? I hear you ask. Everything is an average hotel when you want it to be. So on balance, that's the sort of scale. It's going to take a while for hotels to build back the value that they will have lost in the short term. And we're saying that values could have dipped at best case in 2020, somewhere between 5 and 10%. A most likely case, somewhere between 10 and 20%, and perhaps a worst case, somewhere between 20 and 30% in 2020, compared with where the values were in 2019. However, it's a bit like catching a falling knife, as a friend of mine often says. How do you know when to catch the knife, when to anticipate that is the best time to buy? Well, first of all, the hotel's got to be put on the market. And only people who are desperate to sell or who are being forced to sell are likely to be selling in the current environment. And at the moment, the market is not yet being flooded with hotels for sale. There are a few, but not much. And so the likelihood is that if people can hang on and not have to sell, they're not forced to sell, they're not going to sell, because they realize that there are plenty of people out there. There is a so-called wall of money with the desire to buy hotels at a fraction of their replacement cost or of the price that they might have had to have paid in 2019.
Russell, I know I appreciate the lesson that you just shared with us, so thank you. I have to tell you, the falling knife analogy is still hurting me. That is so painful to hear, but I get the point, literally. So I appreciate that. So I guess what I'm hearing is you're thinking 3.5 years to get back to 2019 occupancies and rates. Is that what you shared with us before?
I'm saying that in Europe we're looking on average room rates coming back in 2024, occupancies getting back a year earlier in 2023. So RevPAR back to where it was in 2019 in 2024.
Patricia, great. Okay, and Patricia, are you thinking similarly or a little bit differently for the region? What is SDR sort of prognosticating?
Well, we obviously reviewing our market forecast constantly, and there's, you know, uncertainty is the key word here. But we're not very confident that we can get worldwide. We're not gonna. I would say I'm with Russell in the terms of, you know, it really depends on the market and it really depends on what type of hotels we're talking about. So on the positive side, if we look at China, we've seen how the mid-scale and economy markets are pretty close to 2019 levels. However, if we go to other regions, we are far from it. So our forecast at the moment is not expecting occupancies to be back at 2019 levels until 2 years' time.
2 years' time. Kaushik, what do you think?
2 years, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Kaushik, are you thinking similarly, or?
Yeah, so I think, of course, you know, needless to say, the wild card here is when does when do we have a vaccine, and when do things start getting better? Because I think in most markets around the world, a big chunk of the demand comes from the meeting and group and conferencing business, and I don't see large conferences and events happening until there's some level of confidence that you're safe when you get there, or then that'll probably happen after the vaccine's available. But when I look at this part of the world, yeah, I mean, I think 2020 is a washout. In many ways, 2021 is probably a washout too. 22 is when we start seeing occupancy levels start to come back up, and 23, 24 probably when you can expect to get back to the RevPAR levels of 2019. To Russell's point, I think we have seen these in other crises, right? We saw this in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks, the global financial crisis, other crises around the world. Owners don't want to sell their hotel unless they're forced to, right? And the first option is, can I go back and renegotiate with my banker or my lender and renegotiate my terms and my repayment so that I don't have to sell. So a lot of who's going to be forced to sell is going to depend on how the financial system treats these outstanding hotel loans and how willing they are to work with the owners to restructure and help the owners out.
Thanks, Kaushik. Adeline, just any thoughts on your particular region in terms of coming back to 2019 levels?
I think it'll be very market specific. For China itself, I think markets that are business in tier 2, tier 3, like I mentioned just now, numbers have bounced back. Those, the same for leisure in weekend destinations. I think overall, outside China for Southeast Asia, or let's say North Asia per se, I would expect, 18 to 24 months, to be the very least. I think occupancy will bounce back first, followed by ADRs and of course RevPARs. I think also noteworthy is because a lot of travel within Asia is regional. So I think there's a lot of regional demand that will be filtered to, that will stay within the destination, whether for short or medium haul travel. And so I think that helps compared to certain destinations, let's say in Asia, where they're very highly dependent on long haul travel, say the Maldives, for example, or, maybe markets where Phuket or Bali, where, there's a certain percentage of long haul travel. Those will probably return slightly later, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you. We only have about 7 or 8 minutes left, and there's still lots of questions coming in. So let me address this one to Patricia, because we were just talking about this before we started our formal conversation today. Someone's asking here about the difference between independent hotels and the branded hotels and recovery. What are our thoughts on the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities? Patricia, I know you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, well, in Latin America, we have a very large percentage of independent properties. So we are monitoring those very closely. They don't have the financial backup that the brands may have, and that's causing a lot of distress. I mean, as Russell said, distress, all hotels are under distress, but these ones, they have a lot of difficulties because they don't have the cash flow to really keep the hotel closed for as long as it's already closed. And going back to some of the measures that we discussed earlier, one of the things that we're not really seeing in the majority of the countries in South America is credit lines to help out with that. And that's a need that they're gonna be, that they all have and they're gonna be having. And particularly for independent properties, it's very difficult to get it at this point. So also there's a lot of opportunities and the way we see it, there's a lot of opportunities for rebranding. So maybe, get the support of a brand for an independent property. There's, I have a lot of clients that are looking at, what can we change within the hotel? Do we need to try to not just changing the design, because I think that's a minimum part of what can be done, but, are we positioning ourselves in a different segment that make more sense now? So if you were very dependent on MICE business and events, maybe, we know that that's the last segment that's gonna come back with this crisis, because we're not supposed to be more than 10, 15, I don't know how many people, depending on the country, that are allowing to sit together. So obviously that's gonna be farther on the recovery phase. So can we try to change that sort of demand for us? And the other thing is they're focusing a lot on ways to improve and educate the employees to kind of have a different experience for the guests when they return and they open. And I think that's quite interesting, because we talk a lot about sustainability and how we can bring the whole local sourcing and really having an impact as a hotel, but also the tourism industry as a whole. You know, it can have a massive impact on local communities and how we can take this opportunity to rethink how we're doing things.
No, that's a great point. And actually, you've addressed a question that did come in about repositioning. Do hotels have to change their comp sets even as we get through this? So thinking about sort of what do we need to do to modify to stay relevant. I think that was a really great point that you asked. We've just got a couple of minutes left. There's one hot button question that came in actually from one of our incoming master's students about hiring in the industry. How is the pandemic affecting sort of labor in the industry? Because now there's a whole new labor pool out there, isn't there now? So anyone want to address that real quick before we wrap up? Any thoughts on talent?
I wish I had more encouraging news for those who are about to enter the business, or any business for that matter. Every employer worldwide, unless they're very fortuitous, will have to look at their hiring and take a view on who they can afford to bring onto their books as employees. This business has long been a people business, and being a glass half full person, I'm optimistic that over time we will get back to where we were and get back to employing people in the sort of jobs that people are interested in fulfilling. But I think people need to be patient. I think that people need to accept that the difficulty is not short-lived. And if we look back over the last 20 years and we look at the cycles that have taken place, the post 9/11, the global financial crisis of 2009 and so forth, they've taken 6 years overall for RevPAR to go from peak to peak. So that recovery is going to take time to filter through to the hiring decisions that hotels make. All I can say is the business has always relied on great talent. And if you are talented, then I'm hopeful that you'll hang in there and make sure that you apply your talents to the hotel business somewhere in the world as soon as is possible.
Thank you, Russell.
Every success.
Thank you. So I'm going to use that, if that's okay. I want to wrap up with just a key thought from each of you as we wrap up, because we're at the 11 o'clock mark here on the East Coast. But I'm learning from you, Russell, if there's a takeaway from this or some words of advice, it's patience. And I think that's really important for many of us. Anything you want to add to that, Russell, before I ask Patricia and Adeline and Kaushik for a last word before we wrap up?
Well, I think we're all of the view that people are absolutely vital to the success of our business, and you can reduce your staff to a certain extent, but at some point you have to recognize that we need to bring people back in and to populate our hotels with well-trained staff as well as motivated customers who have got past their fear of travel. And I hope that can be as fast as possible in every country.
Super, thank you. Kaushik, anything you'd like to add as a last word?
Yeah, so, I think if you look at just numbers and how we've traveled from the beginning of time, from the time humans were on this earth till 2000, it took us to 2012 for us to get to 1 billion people traveling across the world, right? It took that long for 1 billion of us to travel around the world. We went from 2012 to today. We've added another 400 million travelers visiting different places. And the expectation is that by the time you get to 2025, you'll hit the 2 billion mark. So we as human beings are not going to stop traveling the earth. We are not going to stop staying in hotels. We're not going to stop eating out. All of that will come back. It's not going away. I think we're just looking at a short-term period. And I think if you're coming out of college now, this is the best time to go out there and consider it an unpaid internship, but go out there and get all the experiences you can get, because you're going to have legendary war stories to tell when we're done with this period and we get to the other side.
Thank you, Kaushik. Patricia, a last word we've got industry folks as well as students and alumni here who are in the industry. Any last words for us or any takeaways from what you've learned here? so far?
Yeah, if I put my STR hat on, I would say look at the information. There's a lot of data, a lot of information out there, and use that for planning, you know, the recovery and the opening up of the hotels and the business in general. And if I put my personal hat on, I just want to say that, you know, let's be grateful for what we have, because even though it's a very difficult situation, there's a lot of people that are in worse shape than we are. So just remind yourself to be grateful.
Thank you for that reality check. Absolutely. Adeline, last word.
I think we just need to be agile at this time. So, you know, what you were doing before may not be the best time at this, you know, for now, but doesn't mean that, you know, 12 months, 24 months later, that won't work. So, you know, you just need to adapt, I think, and see, you know, what are the opportunities, because I think there are. It's just a transformation of that opportunity in new industries, digital or technology, you know, pharmaceuticals or medical. So there are opportunities. There's even, you know, the way that the shared economy will transform into you know, post-pandemic. So I think it's really trying to take advantage and sieving out those, you know, gaps and pockets. So I don't think things will be as easy as before, but, you know, if you're hardworking, you persist, I think that, you know, something will prevail.
Wonderful. I'm thankful to all of you for our friendships, to have such great colleagues globally, to share the knowledge. Thank you. And I want to tell everyone out there that we will travel again, because we have to travel again, as Kaushik said. And frankly, that's the way that we all get to appreciate and understand and respect and love each other and our planet. So with that, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. Have a great day, everybody. See you soon.